RTB 101, where we discuss practical questions to help equip you to share your faith more effectively. And here to help me talk about a very provocative topic today is biochemist Dr. Fazale Rana. Welcome, Fuz.
Krista, thanks for having me.
Now, I know that you have a very strong personal passion to advocate for the value and sanctity of human life. I'm just wondering, as we kind of wade into this conversation, why is that issue so important to you personally?
Yeah, well, I take very seriously what Scripture teaches about human origins and human identity, namely that we are creatures that are made in God's image as the crown of creation. But because we're image bearers, every human being has intrinsic value and worth that's beyond measure. And in fact, Scripture teaches us that the way we treat others who bear God's image is equivalent to the way we would treat God Himself. So to me, that leads me to a very strong pro-life position, and I include in that pro-life position the human embryo, where I equate a human embryo to a human person. So to me, pro-life concerns extend to the unborn.
Now, that leads me to something that I saw on your blog recently. Your blog title is The Cell's Design. And you were commenting on an idea that is put forward by some atheists that God is actually not pro-life. I've never heard this argument. It was new for me. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the idea behind this argument.
Yeah, well, I've actually heard the argument quite a bit, and there were fortunately some interesting scientific advances that allowed us to address this concern. But the idea is this, that in human beings, presumably there's a very high rate of what are called spontaneous abortions, where embryos die before they reach, birth. And the argument goes, really, it's twofold. One is that if human beings are the crown of creation, well, couldn't God have come up with a better way for humans to reproduce that wouldn't lead to the death of that many human beings, again, who bear God's image even before they're born? And then also, it's like, well, how could God be pro-life if the rate of spontaneous abortions are so high? And the argument would go, look, when people do voluntary abortions, this is really just a drop in the bucket compared to the huge number of spontaneous abortions that happen in humans all the time. So how could you say that God values the life of an embryo, given the flawed nature of human reproduction?
And maybe another term for spontaneous abortions, we might call them miscarriages. Is that what we're talking about here?
Well, in some instances, I think you would call it a miscarriage. In other instances, it's actually an abortion that happens, or an embryo death that happens before the embryo even implants into the uterine wall.
Okay.
So I think under those circumstances, spontaneous abortion would be the appropriate term, more so than miscarriage.
So help fill out this picture for me. Like, what is some of the data that atheists put forward to try to support their case that God is actually not pro-life?
Yeah. Well, to be fair, atheists and skeptics will cite reputable sources like the March of Dimes or the CDC that claim about 70% of embryos die before they even implant, from the point of fertilization before they even implant. And of those that do implant, there's another maybe 25% or so that will never be born. And so in some some statistical analyses, you see about 90% of embryos dying before birth, which means pregnancy is only about 10% successful. So those are the numbers that people banter around.
So how can we start to think about this issue from a Christian worldview perspective? Maybe you can share with us some of your thoughts of how you've worked through that.
Yeah, well, first of all, when I've heard these numbers, I've always had the sense that these numbers were exaggerated and probably based on highly speculative data. And it was gratifying to me to see a publication recently by a reproductive biologist who argued that the numbers indeed that are cited by the CDC and the March of Dimes are indeed exaggerations. And again, based on really very tentative data. For example, he points out that nobody knows what the death rate is for embryos from the point of fertilization to the point of implantation. That is literally a scientific black box. We have no data on that. So any numbers that people produce there are sheer fiction. They're not based on evidence at all. He also points out that once an embryo implants, about 70% of them will actually go to successful birth, where there's only about a 30% rate of spontaneous abortion or miscarriages. And of those that actually do happen, where the pregnancy is aborted, it's usually happening within the first few days after implant. So it's very early on in the pregnancy before women will even know that they are pregnant, before they even miss a period. So his point is that actually human reproduction is really much more efficient than is commonly understood. You couple that with some recent insights from people that are studying, again, the process of implantation. And what we learn is that the endometrium, which is a layer of cells in the uterine lining, actually has a gatekeeper function, that it's a really sophisticated piece of tissue that can actually detect if an embryo suffers from chromosomal abnormality. And if it does, it will not allow that embryo to implant, or it will slough it off if it does begin the implantation process. So to me, what we're looking at here is really an elegantly designed process that can detect, again, chromosomal abnormalities and prevent those embryos from actually entering into the process of pregnancy, knowing that those embryos are going to die. They're never going to make it to birth. So you could actually see it as a bit of a divine mercy, again, because many times these spontaneous abortions happen before women even realize that they are pregnant. And, chromosomal abnormalities are going to arise simply because of the nature of the laws of physics. We live in a world that conforms to the laws of thermodynamics, and mistakes are going to happen, errors are going to happen. And so this really is a protective mechanism in the light of those errors to prevent an embryo from going into pregnancy that would never survive.
Very good. That's very helpful. It gives us some things to think about. And it really, it sounds like is very worldview dependent, kind of how you look at, whether this is God's grace or whether he's, not for life. So this is interesting. Thank you, Fuzz, for helping us think through this potential objection to our faith. And I do want to encourage you to go check out Fuzz's blog at The Cells Design. You can find it on our website at reasons.org.